In the near future, global warming has caused a huge rise in sea levels and wiped out coastal cities all over the world. Millions of people have been displaced and the now crazy climate causes global famine, so governments implement licensing pregnancy to fight overpopulation. To compensate for this, scientists create a series of robots known as mecha, who don't require as many resources to survive as humans do. The inventor of these mechas is Professor Hobby, who takes a female mecha apart in a conference while he explains that robots are programmed to react to damage or pain and to remember to avoid the cause of damage like a human would. Unfortunately, this doesn't mimic human emotion, which brings Hobby to the next step, a robot child programmed to love its parents. This mecha will be marketed to couples who yearn for a child but can't obtain the license to reproduce. 20 months after the presentation, Henry and his wife Monica visit their son Martin in the hospital. Martin was diagnosed with a rare disease and put in suspended animation until a cure is found. Martin's doctor worries about Monica, who still hopes for that cure and often comes to read to his son, and he advises Henry to help Monica cope with the grief she's currently suppressing. Hoping that this will help his wife to move on, Henry applies to Cybertronics beta testing and gets chosen by Hobby to test his latest invention, a child mecha named David. This robot is a prototype mecha child programmed to experience love. Monica is offended by the idea and argues with Henry, saying that he's trying to replace Martin when he isn't even dead yet. However, Monica eventually realizes that she needs to fill a hole in her heart and has a big need to take care of a child again, even if it's a mecha. After finally changing Monica's mind, Henry explains how the imprinting protocol works. Once they decide to keep David, they can choose to activate his imprinting, making David loyal to them just like a regular child that loves their parents. The imprinting is irreversible, meaning that if the couple ever decides to return David, he'll be scrapped. So it's very important for them not to imprint until they are sure. Later in the evening, Monica and Henry allow David into Martin's old room. David is eager to get along and make his parents happy, but remembering that he's not real makes Monica nervous, and she ends up shutting the door on him when he asks her to dress him. The next morning, David watches Monica prepare breakfast with pure curiosity. He continues to watch her the rest of the day as she does her chores, no matter how hard Monica tries to ignore him. When she grows too frustrated, Monica ends up putting David away in the closet. Moments later, Monica feels guilty and lets David out, excusing herself by saying that they're playing hide and seek. This makes David surprise Monica in the bathroom while she's relieving herself, thinking she's hiding there. During dinner, David watches his parents eat, and he's so fascinated by this that he pretends to drink from an empty glass to mimic Henry, then copies the way Monica eats pasta. When noodles get stuck in Monica's lips, it makes David laugh, which startles his parents into laughing along. Later in the evening, when Monica gets David ready for bed, she finally tends to him as if he was her real son. However, this also reminds her of Martin in the hospital, making her cry. The next morning, Monica decides to initiate the imprinting protocol, coming to terms with the fact that she needs David to cope with Martin's situation. After she finishes saying the code that will trigger David's love, the boy's face softens up and for the first time he calls Monica mommy. This already makes Monica more attached to him, especially when he hugs her. One night, Monica is happily getting ready to attend an event with Henry. However, Henry worries about Monica's affection for David, reminding her that he's a mecha, but Monica sees David as a gift. When David comes to say goodbye, the parents smell something and realize that he has used up Monica's expensive perfume. To make matters worse, David asks Monica if she'll die someday. Monica confirms that she will, but she doesn't want David to be lonely, so Monica takes an old robotic bear named Teddy that used to be Martin's and gifts it to David so he can have company while they're away. Sometime later, David shows Monica that he can relay the audio from her telephone by turning himself into a speaker. The call comes from Henry, who can't hear Monica because of David's speaker mode. After lots of scolding, David finally hands her the phone, and Monica receives some big news. A few days later, Monica comes home together with Martin, who has woken up from his suspended sleep and has been cured of his rare disease. As the days pass, Martin treats David like a toy, asking him to break things for him and questioning how he was made as he pokes his face. When asked for the first thing he remembers, David draws a bird with feathers sticking out of the tail. One afternoon, Martin asks Monica to read Pinocchio to him and David, secretly hoping to taunt David with the story. However, David is fascinated by the idea of a puppet turning into a real boy. During lunch, Martin teases David into an eating contest. Monica and Henry panic, knowing that the act could break David, but the boys don't listen to their warnings and keep on eating. In the end, David stops as one side of his face droops, scaring everyone. Afterward, David is taken for repairs while Monica holds his hand. However, hearing him say it doesn't hurt makes her freak out. Seeing his mother worry about David so much makes Martin jealous, so when they go home, he tricks David into secretly cutting Monica's hair while she's asleep by telling him she'd love him for it. At first David refuses, but Martin manipulates him until he agrees. Then David goes into the parents' bedroom to cut Monica's hair with a pair of scissors, but at that moment, Monica turns and almost gets hurt by the blades. Henry wakes up when Monica screams and he shakes David angrily, demanding to know why he did it until Monica stops him. Some hair falls to the floor and is found by Teddy. Sometime later, while they're getting things ready for Martin's birthday party, Henry tries to convince Monica that David is no longer worth the risk, but Monica defends David by saying he's just a child making mistakes. During the party, Martin's friends taunt David, poking his synthetic skin and using a knife to test his lack of pain. This triggers David's defense programming, which makes him hide behind Martin because he's the only human he feels safe with. He also begins backing away, but he moves too far and accidentally drags Martin to the bottom of the pool. The adults quickly come to take Martin out of the water to give him CPR, while David can only watch from the pool as he is left behind and alone. After this incident, Monica becomes wary of David, but she also finds the beautiful letters David writes for her, leaving her torn on how she feels about him. Finally, she decides she has no choice and tells David that they'll go on a trip with Teddy, and David is happy because he thinks he's spending the day with his mother. The next day, Monica cries while she drives to Cybertronics to have David destroyed. In the end, the guilt is so overwhelming that she changes her plan and drives the car into the woods, where David sets up a picnic mat without suspecting anything. Monica quickly stops him and finally tells him that she has to leave him for good. Devastated, David begs and apologizes for everything he'd done. He also wonders if he would be accepted back in the family if he became a real boy like Pinocchio. Monica doesn't give in to his pleas, and before leaving, she gives David some money and tells him not to be caught by anyone, especially Cybertronics. David latches to her and doesn't want to let her go, so Monica has to shove him away, surprising them both. Then she apologizes and drives away, leaving David to watch the car in the distance. Meanwhile, in Rouge City, a mecha named Joe is emotionally comforting his client before spending the night with her, which is his job. Afterward, Joe makes his way through town to meet his next client at a hotel. The owner asks Joe for his operating license badge, as an anti-robot group known as Flesh Fair is hunting for stray mechas in town. Then Joe changes the color of his hair before going to his client's room. When he sits on the bed, he's shocked to find it wet with blood, and his client turns out to be dead. At that moment, a man appears in the room, confirming he was the one who killed the woman. Joe realizes that he's been set up and immediately runs away to hide in an alley, where he uses a little blade to remove his operating license badge so he can't be traced. In the woods, David tells Teddy that he wants to find the blue fairy from Pinocchio so she'll turn him into a real boy. Suddenly, a garbage truck passes by to dump scrap parts, and tons of abandoned mechas show up to search through the trash in order to repair themselves. As David watches without believing what he's seeing, Joe shows up as well, and there is a moon-shaped aircraft coming after him. It turns out it's the Flesh Fair group, and the mechas immediately begin running away in fear as they are hunted down. This group kidnaps mechas and destroys them in a show to prove their anti-robot campaign. They use a scan on their aircraft to follow the mechas, but there's also a bunch of them appearing in the forest riding motorcycles that begin chasing the mechas through the woods, eventually entering a small town. These guys fire magnetic discs to trap the robots, and a few mechas are sadly captured, but David and Teddy manage to follow a few mechas into an abandoned cottage and meet a nanny mecha, who offers to care for him. Unfortunately, the motorists still find the cottage and break down the wall to capture them all, while the aircraft picks up Joe in a cage. In the struggle, David tries to hold on to Teddy, but he falls. At least a bunch of branches break his fall, so he quickly recovers and chases after the aircraft. Later at the Flesh Fair show, Teddy is picked up by employees and thrown into Lost and Found. In the stadium, the crowd cheers as old and abandoned mechas keep getting destroyed by being pushed inside cannons and shot out on fire. A terrified David holds onto Joe's hand, who's surprised by the touch. Meanwhile, Teddy manages to climb out of Lost and Found, and finds David in a cage. At that moment, a little girl picks up Teddy and sees David, thinking that he's a real boy. Then the girl approaches her father, who's one of the programmers of the show, and the man is disturbed to hear that a boy is among the mechas. Back at the cage, David learns from the other mechas that the humans are cutting them down to maintain superiority. Then the girl's father approaches David and uses a portable X-ray to make sure that David is a robot. The father is shocked and fascinated by David's advanced system, but the showrunner is not amused, and an argument ensues while David watches the nanny mecha get doused in acid as part of a game. The showrunner insists on putting David on the show too, ignoring the programmer's explanations of how valuable David is. Then the showrunner takes David, and since he's holding on to Joe's hand for safety, both are dragged to the field and into the acid trap. As the showrunner presents David to the crowd, he also rants about how the mecha child insults the human population. However, the crowd turns silent because they aren't used to seeing children in the show, and now they feel conflicted. Suddenly, acid falls onto David's shoulders, making him scream and cry in fear. This convinces the crowd that David is a real child, and they're so horrified that they turn on the showrunner, throwing things at him, while the girl's dad orders the guards to free David and Joe right before the riot starts, allowing the duo to escape safely. In Hobby's office, there are various photos of David growing up, and it's revealed that he was designed after Hobby's late son. A team arrives to report that David was spotted at the Flesh Fair, and they assure Hobby that the mecha is fine. Back in the woods, David and Teddy freeze when they suddenly see the moon, thinking that it's the Flesh Fair's aircraft. Just in case, they take a different route, and David shares with Joe his wish to find the blue fairy. Joe says that most women can be found in Rouge City, and they agree to head there together. First they need a ride, so Joe finds a group of teenagers and uses a hologram pen to manipulate them, promising lots of mecha women in their future. The boys give them a ride, and once they reach the city, Joe gives David a tour, teaching him about the flashing lights and the weirdly shaped buildings. David becomes fascinated by a statue of an angel because he thinks it's the Blue Fairy and tries to enter the church, but Joe takes him away. Eventually they meet with Dr. No, a program that serves as an all-knowing encyclopedia. Using the money Monica gave him, David learns from No that the Blue Fairy is at the end of the world. This information comes from a quote by Hobby. Joe doesn't like it because he knows that mechas that go to the end of the world never come back, so he tries to explain to David that humans hate robots. However, David insists that Monica will love him if he's a real boy, not believing Joe when he says a human can never love a mecha and yelling at him for dealing to insinuate the opposite. When they leave No's store, the cops find them and arrest Joe, still thinking he killed the woman in the hotel. Curious, David gets into the helicopter's driver's seat and powers it on, but obviously he can't control it and his so-called piloting causes huge chaos around the city, breaking things and almost hitting people. As citizens run away in panic, Joe uses the distraction to escape the cops and reunite with David. Joe jumps inside the helicopter, taking over the controls to fly the vehicle smoothly and escape safely. A few hours later, they reach the wasteland that was previously Manhattan, which Joe calls the place where lions weep. After the trouble with the sea levels rising, the remaining pieces of the city are left in ruins and underwater. David finds a bunch of lion statues with water pouring out of their mouths, which reminds him of Joe's quote. Seeing it as a sign, they land the helicopter in the building next to the lions, then David and Joe search for Professor Hobby. David finds a door with a fairy tale quote on it and crosses it, finding a chair with someone on it. When it turns around, David is shocked to find a child that looks exactly like him. The other David simply smiles and invites him to read with him, saying that he's real, but the first David thinks this guy is going to replace him. Furious, David grabs a lamp and smashes it against the table in the other David's head, revealing that it's also a mecha. A terrified Joe goes away while David lashes out, screaming that he's special and unique. At that moment Professor Hobby shows up to stop him and assures David that he's a real boy, claiming that he is his own Blue Fairy. Dr. No's clues on finding the Blue Fairy were explicitly made to lead David to Professor Hobby, and the journey also tested David's motivation to see if it was strong enough to make him chase an unknown dream, which other mechas can't do. Hobby walks out of the office to gather his team, leaving David thinking about the fact his journey has been part of someone else's design. Afterward, David enters another room, where he finds several more mechas that look like him, including one that is still open. He approaches a window and sees the bird he remembers as his first memory, which turns out to be a statue outside the office. Several boxes are laid out as David and his female counterpart are mass-produced to be sold. Realizing that he was never unique, David heads outside and drops into the water as Joe watches from the helicopter. Underwater, a bunch of fish carries David until he falls in front of something that catches his attention. David reaches out, but Joe finds him first and pulls him away using the helicopter's extended arm. Once he's out, David realizes that he found the Blue Fairy underwater. Unfortunately, before they can go further, Joe is suddenly magnetized by a police helicopter hovering above them. Joe says goodbye to David, asking him to tell his story to the ladies once he's grown up as a real boy. Then he activates the helicopter's submarine mode before floating away. Determined to find the Blue Fairy, David pilots the transformed helicopter into an abandoned carnival with Teddy beside him. They watch all the attractions representing fairy tales and eventually discover Pinocchio, which he follows until he finally finds the Blue Fairy statue. At that moment, the Ferris wheel collapses on top of the helicopter, trapping them. David doesn't care though, he only has eyes for the Blue Fairy and begs her to make him a real boy. However, the fairy doesn't respond, and years pass with David still stuck in there, never losing hope even when the lights begin to die off. 2,000 years later, the world is enveloped in ice and snow, and humans have been gone for a while. One day an alien spacecraft shows up and flies around Manhattan as they colonize the planet. There they move David's helicopter, finding him and Teddy on the ice. They quickly reactivate him and David proceeds to convulse before he notices the Blue Fairy in front of him. He immediately gets out of the helicopter and approaches the frozen statue while the alien creatures watch him. Then he touches the Blue Fairy, causing it to crack and break in front of him. The aliens use this chance to scan David's memory to understand the planet better, and suddenly David finds himself sitting at the table in Monica's house. The home looks exactly the way he remembers it, and David eagerly searches for Monica, but it's a different voice that replies. David is surprised to find the Blue Fairy alive and talking and asks her to turn him into a real boy, but she admits that she can't do that. The aliens use the Blue Fairy to speak to David, informing him that Monica is gone and the fairy can't revive her either because her remains are long gone too. While David mourns, Teddy approaches him to remind David of the time he cut Monica's hair and reveals that he kept that same lock of hair, meaning the aliens could now bring back his mother. David goes to his old bedroom and fondly remembers his friend Joe while Teddy repairs himself. At that moment they see a figure at the door and think it's Monica, but it's actually an alien that confesses to be fascinated by humans. He wishes to bring humanity back by using organic traces to clone them, but unfortunately all his tries have failed so far because the clones only live for one day. This will also happen if they bring Monica back. David still holds on to the hope that Monica will be special like him and last forever like he did while trapped in the helicopter, so he goes looking for her. He finds her in her bedroom and begins to cry while brushing hair from her face. At that moment Monica wakes up and greets David with a warm smile. Now for this one day, David and Monica can spend some time together. David happily shows Monica paintings of his journey, they play hide and seek, and they celebrate his birthday too. When the lights outside grow dim, David tucks Monica into bed, worried that she won't wake up. Suddenly Monica tells him she loves him, which makes David smiles in a mix of grief and joy. Then he decides to sleep next to her, reaching his dreams for the first time in his life. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.